I think we've lost a sense that the past is a resource, that the past is not just something we edit to our predilection. Because when we do that, all we get back is the mirror of ourselves.
My guest today is Professor Wilfred Bill McClay. Professor McClay is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the Director of the Center for the History of Liberty. Dr. McClay's latest book is The Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. Daniel Henninger of the Wall Street Journal said, McClay has written a necessary book, the most balanced, nuanced history of the United States I have read in the past 50 years. Land of Hope has close to 900 five-star reviews on Amazon. Outstanding for a book on American history. I recently sat down with Professor McClay to talk about what motivated him to write Land of Hope and why he thinks it struck such a nerve with so many. Bill, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the show. I have really anticipated this meeting. I read parts of your fantastic book, which I definitely want to get into. And once again, I just want to thank you for being on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure, really. This is a great opportunity to talk with a highly intelligent reviewer and critic and observer. So have I flattered you enough there?
Keep going. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So you wrote a book, Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. Now, I was looking through some of the reviews, and I just want to share one with you. In a time when America seems pulled in opposite directions, Wilfred McClay has written a necessary book. And I quote here, the most balanced, nuanced history of the United States I have read in the past 50 years. This is Daniel Henninger, Deputy Editor, editorial page to Wall Street Journal. Now, you can't pay enough for that. Why did he say that?
Well, I modesty forbids me to say too much about that, except that that's really what I was trying to do. I was trying to not to write a conservative book, a liberal book, a moderate book, but I wanted it to be balanced. I wanted it to give some degree of respect and credibility to a variety of positions, not all of which I agreed with, but that I thought all deserved a hearing. So it's not really an effort to establish a sort of official version of American history, although I think it's interesting that the book, the criticism has all come from the left. What criticism I've encountered, it's all coming from the left, and it's sort of, well, yes, you do take account of slavery, you do take account of these things, but you don't make them the center of things. And that's right, I don't do that. And that's really the nub of the disagreement they have with me, is that I want to acknowledge our faults, but I also want to acknowledge our glories. And I think that to miss one without missing to include one without including the other is a terrible disservice to real historical understanding.
How do you start a book like this? I always want to tell you, just before you even go on, I got sent this book by your publisher about 2 weeks ago. I put it aside. I had so many other books, and I was just reading and going through. I happened to read the 1620 book.
Oh, that's a terrific, yeah.
By Peter Wood, and I had him on the show earlier, and I asked Dr. Wood, I said, he said, people should read more about American history, and I said, could you give my listeners an example of, or just anything that you think they should read? And he looks around his bookcase, he goes, Land of Hope. It's an outstanding history book. So how do you start writing a book like this? That's really, I've read a lot of history books. From William Bennett, The Last Great Hope, I think it was. He wrote a 2-volume book on American history, which is very conservative, has a whole other side of history. Harold Is it Zine or Zine? I never pronounced his name correctly.
Zinn.
Howard Zinn's book, which it sounded like it was written in Moscow. And then I read your book, and I read parts of your book, and I want to get into some parts which I just blew me away. How do you sit down and play not near the baselines? You play right in the center court. How do you go about doing something like that?
Well, it's interesting because first of all, I've been teaching this stuff. I mean, people who see me know that I didn't start doing this yesterday. I've been doing this for 30 years or more than 30 years, and a lot of that time I've taught the introductory course in American history, whatever institution I've been a part of. I always wanted to do that because I wanted students to get a sense a larger sense of American history, of the trajectory of it, the meaning of it, and not just, as Henry Ford said, one damn thing after another. I mean, a lot of us, that's history courses, is one damn thing after another. And in Howard Zinn's case, it's damnable thing after another. But so I've been at this a while, and I've formed, some fairly, I hope, coherent views about American history and about the various controversies in it and their place in a larger understanding. And so I really started out with a sense of the whole. And the first thing I did, as you know, authors generally write the titles for their books last. And with a good deal of help from the publisher often, who says, well, no, you put a title like that, the book won't sell. People, do it this way. And I've had some of my titles tinkered with by publishers who generally knew better than I did what to do with the title. But in this case, the title was the first thing because I thought, what do I want to convey above all to young people? And that's really my audience. This is really I don't want to scare your audience off, but this is really a textbook. It doesn't look like a textbook. It doesn't feel like one, doesn't read like one, but I really meant it for the instruction of young people, juniors and seniors in high school, maybe college students. Some it is being used in college classes. But so what's the one thing I wanted to get across? And that is, I think that America we've changed in lots of ways, but it's always been about aspiration. We are an aspirational nation. We are a nation made up of people who do not believe that your lot in life is what you were born into. That you can go places, you can do things, you can rise, you can fall. It's sort of up to you to do what you can. And that seems to be so fundamentally American, and not just that we have offered the conditions, material conditions, lots of relatively inexpensive land and all of that, but it's the outlook, it's the kind of morale of the country, it's the psyche, the soul of the country that is about hope. So I loved Land of Hope as a title, and I just wrote it out and I pinned it to my computer monitor, and there it stayed for the rest of it. So then it was just a matter of parsing out what, in a lot of ways, my chapter sequence is fairly usual. There's nothing radical about it. There are some things that are subtly different. Like the chapter on the American Revolution, I call the revolution of self-rule, because I want to emphasize that aspect of what the American Revolution was about, that it was not, there's a lot of debates among it. Was it about sort of natural rights? Was it based on religion? Was it based on the radical Whig ideas? Was it economic in character? And was it a revolution of the American elites against the English elites? And was it a social revolution like the French Revolution? And all those debates are out there. But I wanted to emphasize that it was about ruling ourselves. that's one thing I think is irreducibly true, that Americans, and I end the chapter with this wonderful interview with a very elderly patriot who's asked, why did you fight the war? And he goes through all of these different things, this Stamp Act, the tax on tea, and the guy says, no, we didn't care about any of that. And he said, well, why did you fire those shots in Lexington and Concord? And he said, well, look, young man, we had always ruled ourselves. And they were, the Redcoats came to try to end that, and we weren't about to let that happen. And I think that's a very important strain of American history that sometimes gets lost in all these debates about what the revolution was about. So simply the right to rule ourselves.
Right. So why at this juncture in time did you feel such a need to put out a book like this?
Okay, yeah, good question. There was a proximate cause. The advanced placement tests, which are administered, all of them are administered by the College Board, an organization called the College Board. It's a private organization, private nonprofit organization, and they administered the AP U.S. History test, which increasingly, partly by design, is becoming a kind of national standard. That's another story why that's happened. But they, in 2014, they revised the standards for advanced placement testing and for the preparation, advanced placement courses that prepared students to take the exam. And it was a quite shocking overhaul in which political history, the story of how the nation came to be, of the wars involved, of the debates over the Constitution, that whole sequence of events. This was radically de-emphasized in place of, transatlantic economic history, the emphasis on the slave trade and the triangle trade and that sort of thing. And the names George Washington and James Madison did not appear in these guidelines. And so a number of us came together and drafted a letter. About 200 people eventually signed it, protesting and pleading with the College Board to reconsider their changes. And they did retract a lot of it, most of it, in fact. And Dan Henninger, in fact, wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal saying, okay, conservatives, you got what you wanted, now shut up. And but the problem is that I bow to no one in my admiration for Dan Henninger, especially after that quote that you read. But on this, there was something else going on. The textbook publishers had already revised the text in light of the revisions of the AP standards. So people noticed this and they started to say, well, we really need another textbook. We need a textbook. And they would come and say to me, we need another textbook. And I would say, I agree with you. I hope you find somebody to do it, because I didn't really want to. But several people, and chief among them, Roger Kimball, publisher of Encounter Books, and a real dynamo of a person, managed to persuade me to do it. I couldn't believe it myself that when I hung up the phone, I thought, my God, what have I done? Agreeing to this. But I'm so glad I did it, because it gave me an opportunity to kind of pull together what I've been doing for 30 years and distill it down to a very essential core. It's definitely, it's not the last word. And I've called it an invitation to the great American story, because it's not, it's an invitation to a party. It's not the whole party itself. But as an invitation, you want it to be enticing. You want people to want to come. and then come in and take part in a larger and longer conversation. So that's what it was. It was a come on to American history. Come on in, and see that, especially since so much of what young people are taught about American history is negative now, and not all of it is false by any means. It just lacks perspective. That's what I've tried to provide is perspective on our national failings, our national sins, if you will, that are real. I would add, and I often do in the book, that these are not just national, these are not just American sins, these are human sins, these are human foibles, human failings. Something I don't do in the book very much, but I did do a lot as a teacher. It's when I started to hear students talking about America's failings, I will sort of wend my way into asking them, they sort of compared to what question? Tell me another country that was doing better at this time, at this particular time. And usually they don't know enough to answer the question. But if they do know something, they know that nobody was doing better. And that it's unfair and a false understanding of the past to compare American history against a standard of perfection that no other people and no other nation would be expected to meet, impeccably. But if we compare ourselves to other nations, then the opportunity that we offered, even though admittedly that opportunity was often less than complete, there was racial and ethnic discrimination and discrimination against Catholics and Jews was not all that long ago. And I think people who remember that sort of thing are kind of nonplussed by the claim that they are part of a plot of white supremacy. Now, there's actually the record of the country is much of the country's sins is much more diverse than that, and we need to know all of that. We do need to know all of that, but we need to see it in proper perspective. Right. That's the thing that I think is missing. Yeah. I'll just say one other thing quickly that my students are absolutely thrown. They're shocked when I say two things about slavery. First of all, the United States is not the only nation in the history of the world to have slavery. Slavery has been more the rule than the exception throughout human history. The history of the human race is a brutal, ugly thing. And we are, comparatively speaking, a shining light in that. And the second thing is that there are more people enslaved today in the world than were involved, three or four times the number that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. So it's it's perspective that's required, and we don't often offer that, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah, when you see your students, these are college. This is a college student. So
and very good students here at Oklahoma. I have to tell you, we have great students.
Yeah, I think they're coming to the game without much of a background. They're really coming to universities with a watered-down version of what made this country great. And professors like you, which are far and few in between, they're fertile ground. They're really fertile ground to listen to anybody. They really do want to learn. I know I've always loved American history, especially the Revolutionary War period. And I've read as many books as I can on it. And I find it just so fascinating that these were men faced with amazing challenges, and they were the landed gentry, if you will, of their time. Instead of going into business or in addition to business, they felt public service was a calling. And they're creating something new. They're taking on a world power. So to be judged in 21st century standards to what they were doing at the time is just ludicrous. It's just absolute insanity.
No other nation to that point in human history had ever been founded on the view that all men are created equal.
And these are people. These are men in their 30s. right?
Yeah, they're very 30s, 40s. They're very young.
Young, Washington's 41. Franklin's the old man with gout in his 80s. But you had Jefferson, 33, John Adams, 36. These are young men just a few years older than your college students. And they signed their name to a document that they would have been hanged for in the pursuit of creating a new society based on freedom.
Yeah. No, that is one of the things that just seems absolutely miraculous, is that this leadership class arose. I have to say that part of it may well have had to do with the tradition of self-rule that was well established, 150 years in more than 150 years in Virginia, that there were institutions of self-government, and it's when people have the opportunity to interact politically and develop both the skills of politics, but also they have the education and outlook to think about the principles of politics. Then you get the Federalist Papers, and by the way, the Anti-Federalist Papers too. I mean, they are not necessarily always of the same consistent high quality as a Federalist paper, but man, they're very, as reflections on the meaning of political life and the limitations to which we are prone and the things you have to allow for in thinking about politics. They were very wise. They were very prudent. They were not wild-eyed utopian revolutionaries. Even Jefferson, who could be a bit wild-eyed.
I found out how not only reading the Federalist Papers, for example, or just going through and reading what Madison, when he's assigned to come up with some idea, he orders whole sets of books from France on Greek, the Greek form of governments, and this 5-foot man sits and reads all of them, and it's just amazing how in their writings that I've always found, and I'm not a historian, I would probably get a D in your class. They would be so reflective. And they were so wise and mature beyond their years. It's reflective of how they saw the whole picture. They just didn't see their own interests.
No, that's right. That's right. And I think that's one of the real calumnies against them, is the notion that they were solely interested in feathering their nests and creating a regime that would be favorable to them. I think that's clearly not the case, and some of them took enormous risks and
lost fortunes because of it.
Yes. I think the greatest miracle of that time period is Washington himself. I mean, I'm more and more and more impressed with him as time goes on, and with how it just. It's hard to imagine that we would have made it without him. I read Ron Charno's book, Washington, A Life. Yeah.
And before that, I read McCullough's book on 1776. And I heard an interview with David McCullough. And he said, what fascinated you, or something, I'm not beginning the question 100% right, but the essence of it was, what fascinated you about the Founding Fathers? And he said something which I said, wow, that they didn't get sick. You think of this, what they lived through,
yes.
And at Washington, at Valley Forge, and his wife Martha cleaning up the feces and the human waste between the tents and the dysentery. Oh my goodness! And they didn't get sick. It's fascinating.
Yeah, but now that is, and it's something I've thought about a lot, and I'm sure you have too. And that. It seems that very, very successful people often have constitutions, and I mean their physical constitutions, that are extraordinary, that they only need 3 hours of sleep, and I remember reading that about Henry Kissinger in his prime, thinking, wow, if I only needed 3 hours of sleep, think of what I'd do with the additional 5 that I'd been granted. And I think that's I'm not sure that anybody's ever really studied that, the role that just having, the resistance to disease, robust health that conquers all.
And John Adams, for example, his family was going through his daughter with breast cancer. his family with smallpox, or they were getting a
Yes.
vaccine for smallpox. So there were real sicknesses there that most people died in
Yeah.
their 40s and 50s, and these men lived into their
Yeah.
70s and well, Washington's a little younger, 69 and upwards of 80 years old. And Franklin, he lives into his 80 with gout,
Yes.
but he still lives a pretty long life.
Yes, yes. No, and it is again, it's something universal. I think that when you think of people like Alexander the Great and so on, that these were prodigies of strength and resistance to disease.
Yeah, but you put up the point of Washington, right? Washington is Kips Bay, and several times throughout his military, he is really within a whisker of getting killed.
He dealt with all sorts of reversals, going back to the French and Indian War, in which he was
Fiasco.
very, very unsuccessful, let's say, and yet he was indomitable. He absolutely indomitable, and selfless in a certain way. I mean, he was very conscious that he was the first president and that he would be setting precedents in his presidency that would quite possibly extend beyond himself. And so everything he did, he thought about it, thought about appearance. He wasn't just a substance guy. He was an optics guy. He cared about optics.
Yeah, but he just sat in the Constitutional Convention. He sat quietly on the side.
Yeah,
just a grimace
right.
or a smile could change the whole argument in the room. He walked into with a uniform back in the day. He was he was really a clothes horse. So he looked the part. He was 6'1", but you think at any given point, if he was killed, how everything would have been different.
Yeah, and the fact at the Constitutional Convention that there was a willingness to go along with the idea of a strong presidency was clearly because all the delegates present knew that he would be the man, and they trusted him as they would not have trusted anybody else. Yeah. So we are just so blessed, so fortunate to have had such a leader, and he was a real believer in civic virtue, which is actually another aspect of my book, is that I try to not in a hortatory or preachy way, but to get people to see that there's some ways in which we have to be good and active citizens for our nation to stay or restore itself to being a republic. But Washington was absolutely wedded to these ideas, and he twice had for the troops performed Addison's play Cato, which I mentioned in Land of Hope, that this is meant to be a sort of inspirational. It was sort of their Chariots of Fire kind of story that inspire them and get them going and think anything is possible. So he had that ability to be an inspirational leader, more in the sort of example that he gave than in his oratory, which was often a little bit leaden, although his farewell address is one of the great speeches of American history.
Right. So it's fair to say that he wasn't a white supremacist trying to further his interest in the slave trade.
No, I think
all right.
I think that's fair to say.
All right, that was just said tongue in cheek for those who were listening. If you didn't see our facial expressions, totally a joke. So what gets me, Bill, which I just I'm with my mouth hanging open here, for a textbook, a book on history, you have 964 as of this date, 964 5-star ratings, and people are writing. This is a textbook, but I don't want to. By the way, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. But you read something, outstanding history book, a masterpiece. This book should be rated 10. It's hard to put it down. It's engaging. Why? What do you think? What nerve did you strike? I'm going to tell you my opinion in a second. What the nerve you struck in me. What nerve did you strike, or did you think you struck, in Americans that they're so having a love affair with this book?
Oh, well, gosh, I hope you're right that they're having a love affair with the book, but it's I do get a lot of mail. I mean, it's very humbling, really. But there were times I was sitting around with some of my colleagues who, all of whom thought, "Why are you doing this? You know, that this is writing a textbook. This is something. It at best doesn't really count for anything, and at worst is a sort of discrediting thing among academics." And to write with the general public in mind, it's often also, I don't tend to hang out with people like that, but they're everywhere, and in academia, and I remember saying, one night, it was kind of a tongue in cheek, but saying, well, the Romans, Caesar Augustus, it's not clear whether or not he actually commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid. That's debated, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, he certainly knew about it and approved of it, and as a great sort of foundational story of Rome. And I thought, we don't really have, we have these sort of fairy tale versions of American history, and that do leave out or just edit out some of the negative details about our history. And people, I think, rightly say, I can't go for that. To quote the Hall & Oates, I can't go for that. Because I know better. I know we had these things. But what they want is a way to honestly affirm their country, because they know that it's worthy of affirmation. They know it in their hearts, but they also know that we are on a downward trajectory, and that you can have, there's such a thing as a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you tell yourself you are a certain way, then there's really kind of no coming back from that self-understanding. So again, I'm not saying that this is a self-exalting myth. It has to be true, to be believable. But it's just as it's important to be critical, but it's important to have that criticism grounded in appreciation, and an appreciation that is based on a real assessment of how fortunate we are to be part of this.
See, for me, I tell you, that's a good. I like that response. For me, what I found so engaging with your book is your love, reverence, admiration for the system of government we have, for the actors throughout history who built what we have now, really shines through while you're being critical. It's like
thanks.
Yeah,
that's what I tried to do, and I also tried. I mean, it's a love of people in their fallibility. The idea that I had a class this past semester that which we were reading Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, plus his work on the French Revolution. Very interesting class. But I had one student who was, just from the very beginning, he was determined to dislike Tocqueville because he thought Tocqueville didn't condemn everything that the student thought ought to be worthy of condemnation. And I said, well, don't you think it's an important enterprise to try to understand how institutions that you find lamentable, how they arise, whether they arise out of sort of pure, unadulterated evil operating in the world, which is very rarely the case, or out of the mixture of motives that real people in the real world have. And I think he finally came around by the end of the semester, but it was hard at first, and I thought to myself how much he resembled some of the worst tendencies of this current generation, at least the ones we see in the streets, who think that they have the right to pass judgment on not just Robert E. Lee and so the Confederate generals, but Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, a man of incomparable strength and moral focus, moral energy, to pull down his statue. I mean, of course, pull down Columbus, who's a complicated figure, but not a villain. That's one of Howard Zinn's gifts to us, is the villainization of Columbus. I try to encourage people to understand, or my readers to understand, the people of the past in the context of their times, so that someone like Jefferson, who clearly was by our standards, a very confused man who just couldn't quite pull the trigger on renouncing slavery, even though he believed it was wrong. It's very clear that, and then that's, which is not to say he believed in racial equality. That's another matter. But he was a man. He was a man of his times, but also in advance of his times in a lot of ways. And we need to allow for that. I remember I had a great privilege of speaking at the White House on, I think it was Jefferson's 270th birthday or something like that. But and I said in the speech that I quoted from John Lewis, the civil rights leader, who has just recently died, but still was going strong at that time. And I said, quoted John Lewis saying, "Yeah, we knew with Jefferson, it was so important to us. Yeah, of course we knew about his being a slaveholder. But that wasn't what mattered to us. What mattered to us was his words. His words were the fountain from which we drank, and that every generation thereafter can drink from too." And I think that's absolutely right. And if John Lewis says it, I think people ought to listen. People who care about issues of racial justice, racial equality. We need to understand that everybody has elements. It's a dark side. All of us fall short, as the Bible says. All have fallen short of the glory of God. It's in that context, that kind of not non-judgmentalism. Nobody's accused me of being non-judgmental in my book, but not passing judgment, not being the executioner, not saying we're going to ban Huckleberry Finn because we don't like a word that it appears in it, even though the book is and was in its time a great advance in racial understanding. Or Pudd'nhead Wilson, that's the latest one that they've been going after, of Twain's. We are just immensely impoverished by the loss of, and I know people who wouldn't think of teaching Huckleberry Finn now because of the controversy over, which has been in the past, and then it subsided and now it's re-erupted. That we should just cancel, to use the term now in fashion, we should cancel anything that offends our present sensibilities. It's a very strange view of the past. The past is something that we should tailor the way you tailor the backdrop of a painting or a photograph, or the way you tailor, your Facebook page, so that it creates a reality that's more pleasing to your present sensibilities. Well, the past is what it is, and it a lot of it is ugly. A lot of it is horrifying, but it's the only laboratory we have, so to speak, for looking at what human beings are capable of doing.
Well said. Well said. Why do you think it is you've devoted your life to educating, especially in history? Why is it when you mention history, most people's eyes glaze over? Why is that?
I think this goes back to the idea of story, that I think history, in the name itself, historia, they say in Italian, historia, and is in the deepest sense a story. Now we've, especially since the 19th century, we've had this idea that history can be a science, and that we can of course use scientific techniques to understand the past and to reveal aspects of the past that we didn't know were there. I have a colleague who's done amazing work on how plagues and it was very timely. He published a book on the role of plagues in the bringing about the decline of the Roman Empire, right as COVID was about to hit. Mm-hmm. But it's, and there's a lot of research about this, that the eradication of native populations in the New World, the Western Hemisphere, mostly was due to disease and not to rapacious white European settlers who would, wanted to kill anyone with a red skin. And that, of course, all has to do with a lot of science that we understand now that they had not a clue about.
Right, and if I could interject, in Peter Wood's book, he talks extensively about that. About Cortez and a lot of the things that are misconceptions today. We thought we knew what we're talking about. We just missed the boat on that.
Yeah. So that science can help us with these things, but ultimately, the way we, I think, as human beings, one of the ways we know the world is through narratives, through stories, through sequences of events. That how did we get here? What was the path? What was the journey? And what was the nature of the journey? Where did it begin?
So, Bill, let me interrupt you for a second, if I may. History is full of fantastic narratives. Fantastic narratives. Really, they're movie scripts. Yet, so many teachers, so many professors, so many people's students' introduction to history is they suck out all the nutrients, and you're eating boiled over broccoli that sat on the counter for 3 days instead of a succulent steak. Why is that? Why is that?
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of historians think you really have to, and then look, there's a basis for this. A lot of them think you really have to gain a command over a certain factual sort of armory of basic knowledge, almost rote learning, before you can start to think about interpreting the past. And there's something to that. If we have students who don't know whether the Civil War came before or after the First World War, and then you feel like, well, you're in trouble here.
And some of them have no idea which side won.
Yes, right. Even the Revolution. So that's true up to a point, but I think you have to catch them. You have to tell the story in a way that catches them. And I've been working on a young readers edition of Land of Hope for fifth graders who that's when most young people take their first course in American history is in fifth grade, sometimes the sixth grade. And I am finding that one of the most challenging things I've ever done, because you have to simplify. Of course, you have reading level issues. You can't. It's real hard to talk about why did Andrew Jackson oppose the Bank of the United States without getting into things that fifth graders are just not going to understand. I remember I didn't understand all this stuff when I studied it, but how can you tell them something? It's not dumbed down. I'm the enemy of dumbing down. But how do you do that in a way that still grabs them and is still accurate. That doesn't lead them in a false direction. So when they study it again in the 11th grade, they say, oh, McClay was making all this stuff up. And he was ignoring this. This is all false. You don't want to do that. You want to be as true and complete as you can be given the level you're at. And a lot of times you can do more than you think you can. It's just been really much more of a challenge to me than scholarly writing, because then you can explain yourself at length and you can get all those subtleties out there and feel that you're being very complete. But for writing for younger audiences, I think you have to catch them. And some of that can be done with stories and gimmicks, but a lot of it's just in the way you tell it, in the sort of sweep of it. That's what I've always tried with Land of Hope to have this sense that there's a momentum, that there's a way in which what's happening at this time, it depends on and refers back to what was happening this earlier time. And to get people thinking about being in a continuum of time, a big lesson that I say this all the time to my classes is that history teaches us two things: that things have not always been as they are now, and by extension, things will not always be as they are now. And these sound like really silly, stupid assertions, but when you think about it, that's especially for millennials and for this kind of highly mediated generation where everything is about whatever's happening right now, and the sense that such and such is the greatest hip hop artist of all time, all time going back 3 or 4 years. There's no sense of how rooted we are in a long journey, and how exhilarating it is when you realize that, when you realize you have and can cultivate a connection to people decades and centuries ago, and understand them as their contemporaries might have. That's I think history is a work of the imagination. I talk a lot about what I call historical consciousness, which is that's a term that students find very off-putting, and so I don't use it with them much. But to me, it's like the difference when I took my kids to Antietam, the battlefield at Antietam, which, by the way, I think is the most haunting of the Civil War battlefields, just for your audience. It's unlike Gettysburg, which has been kind of done to death. Antietam is relatively unspoiled, and you can walk down that sunken road and think about all the death and mayhem that took place there. But anyway, I let's just say I go to Chattanooga or someplace like that, and to my children. Well, they're running around and they see the same things I'm seeing, but what I see when I look at it, and someone who was a specialist in the Civil War would even more see, is everything that had gone before, all the things that happened, a century and a half ago in that place. And that's having a historical consciousness. The better example of that, and this is another thing that changed my life, is one of my friends in college was the nephew of a man named Henry Hope Reed. And Henry Hope Reed was one of the great architectural historians of New York City. He was also curator of Central Park. And I came to know him as Uncle Henry. And I was up visiting my friend once at the 4th of July, and Uncle Henry came by and said, "Hey, how'd you like me to take you on a tour of Lower Manhattan?" Mm. So we did this. I had no interest in history at this point, especially American history. And so we went down to the Battery and kind of started up from there. And Uncle Henry, who was this incredibly energetic guy, we walked for about 6 hours through Lower Manhattan. And we would go by, a building and pause, and he'd say, "Well, now, in this year, such and such lived here, and then this happened here, and then it was remodeled in 1919 and whatever, and on. He had this sense of the place that I couldn't see it in Rome or Madrid or Jerusalem, someplace like that, but in New York City, he had this very keen sense of the presence of the past. The past was still imminent in these buildings. And the more you knew, the more you felt that imminence. I think that's something we need to cultivate in ourselves, is that sense of the historical imagination. What I call historical consciousness.
I totally hear what you're saying, because when my kids were young, I took them to Brooklyn Heights, and there's a plaque where it stands now, and I see the Battle of Long Island playing out through Kings Highway, coming here, and you're back against the wall, and you have the East River there. That is just unbelievable. Yeah. You can see the ships coming, and every time I'd go there, they go, "Okay, we got it, Dad. We want to go on the swings." And I just look at her, I say, "You're Washington. What do? Your back is against the water. You're losing." Yeah. And then a fog rolls in, and here's what he does. And I tell them, and I go, "Well, what about the ships?" I go, "There happened to be a wind up the East River that prevented the British." Was that a miracle? I said, "Well, they sure, sir. If it wasn't for that, the game was over. That was it. We lost."
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. So I think that a lot of teachers teach it from the book, and they don't live it. And it's a shame.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's I'll give you another example of something that happens, and it really can help when you can find a way to connect history with the experience of young people. I mean, that's always been true. I think it's more true than ever now. But I've taught in places. Well, I taught in Tennessee, in East Tennessee, where a lot of the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, had an enormous impact on that region, and there were lots of stories of people who were displaced from their land. There are a lot of stories that are never told. But anyway, when we were covering the New Deal in class, I said, "Hey, go home and talk to your parents or your grandparents, or in some cases great-grandparents, because that area is very stable that way, about what they remember about TVA and the effects of it. And let me know. You can write, for paper assignment, you can write about that." Well, it's astonishing. And one family at graduation told me, "You changed our family, because all of a sudden my son wanted to know about these things from his grandparents." And they started having these amazing conversations about not just TVA, but about the New Deal, about Roosevelt, about prohibition, all sorts of things that all of a sudden they discovered they had a connection to this in their own lives. And the grandparents were just thrilled that instead of their kids being like alien creatures that for whom ancient history was, Britney Spears, they felt the connection to the past too. So it's wonderful when you can come up with things like that. The best is immigration, because no matter where you live, especially now, no matter where you live, you're going to run into people who either have had the experience of immigration, or they're second generation maybe, or they know people. And to sort of connect that with larger currents of American history, especially I think where you have a longer record, that the great 19th century immigrated, the Russian Jewish, Polish, Italian, Greek, Irish. Of course, Irish go back to the 1840s even, and Germans. Then there are all sorts of stories, including some of these stories about prejudice and how difficult it was to make their way, and that the country was not always welcoming, and all of that's part of the story. But I would ask kids, if you have someone in your family who's close to the experience of immigration, talk to them about it, and come and tell us about it. And it was, even in East Tennessee, there was enough of that you could really make some hay with it. And suddenly the past was something just really alive. And there goes those lights again. Let me go get that. Okay.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I just wish more teachers would do what you're doing to make the history connect, make it more alive, make it more enjoyable, because they're competing with something that no one ever had before, the internet. So many distractions, Instagram, 6-minute things. So it has to be good. It has to be really great. But your book is, I think, a first step. And I hope others pick up your cue after they see how successful your book has become and how well received it is. I hope other historians of academia really come out of their shell and say, there's a big world out there, and we really have to do battle, because the battlefield is going to be won with information, and we see it's being lost now. It's being lost with misinformation, to the point of fantasy, to the point of just crap being made up, and with the label of history, which is so terrible for this country and for the citizens and for our kids.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's very unfortunate. There are people, you mentioned Ron Chernow and David McCullough, and there are people who are doing great things. And look at Chernow's book on Hamilton. It results in a Broadway musical. But most college professors are not. They don't have the talent. They don't have the talent that Ron Chernow has, and the energy and drive. It takes a lot to work that way, and I don't think I think he might have had a visiting lectureship or something at CUNY or something like that, but I don't think he's an academic at all. McCullough is not.
Certainly not. He's not a historian. He was never trained as a historian, which makes him so good.
Yes. He's virtually impossible to reach, by the way. He has no email, and I don't think you can even call him on the telephone. He lives on Martha's Vineyard, and there's a post office box. I have an address for him. I corresponded with him a couple times.
Yeah, and he writes all his books on I think, an Underwood typewriter.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a beautiful thing. But but this is just what I since we're winding down here. I just want to make one point that I think we've lost a sense that the past is a resource. That the past is not just something we edit to our predilection, because when we do that, all we get back is the mirror of ourselves. It's as if you go to the window to look out, but the window is like the one way mirror. It reflects back to you. That's what happens when we construct the past consciously in the image of what we want the present or the future to be.
Wow.
We shouldn't do that. Although at the same time, and I have to admit, this may sound a little bit contradictory, what I just said, but I don't think it is. I'm very concerned about the version of American history that young people are learning and how demoralizing it is to them. It gives them a sense that they have no future. I'm struck by the statistics that they're out there about, for example, the one that really grabs me is that the rate of suicide of young people between the age of 10 and 24, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years has gone up 60%.
Yeah, and especially during last year, during COVID, it soared.
Yes, COVID yeah, we don't really have yet the full toll, but it's going to be awful. And the lingering effects of that are going to be awful. I mean, kids have been deprived a year of their lives, and some parents have done a great job, or they think they've done a great job, and I think many of them have done a great job. But wow, it's just. But leaving aside COVID, how much of this sense that there's no future worth living for it comes from, let's say, the 1619 Project, which teaches that America has encoded in its DNA. This is what they say. I'm not making that up. The sort of contagion of anti-Black racism is at the core of our being, and if it's in your DNA, it means that short of some sort of engineering that we don't have now, but engineering of the human person, we'll always be this way, and we'll always be guilty. That's a demoralizing prospect. It's demoralizing for white kids. It's demoralizing for Black kids too. And I think we have to stop it. That is antithetical to what it means to be an aspirational nation. Right. And to be an aspirational nation, to be a land of hope, is a kind of spiritual matter. It's not just we are abundantly blessed with material resources, have always been. All that's true. So is Brazil, but we had other things here that they haven't had in Brazil, and this aspirational quality. That's why Brazilians come here, or now Africans more and more are coming here, and they don't understand. I don't know whether you get the African cab drivers where you live. I seem to get them all the time, and they're always going, "What is all this?" They don't get it. They don't understand. They don't understand what BLM and other movements like that are really about. Because for them, this has been the greatest thing that ever happened to them to come to this country.
I once had an Uber driver just a few months ago, and he was taking me to the airport, and he was from one of the Eastern European countries. I forgot. I don't want to say because I'm going to be wrong. And I always strike up a conversation. What a great land this is, that here you are driving me. We're having a conversation. You're in your own business as an Uber driver, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you love best about this country? He goes, I go to the faucet, I turn on, I get clean water.
Yeah.
So... what more can one say, right? We have clean water, we have sanitation, and we have our bellies are full. Yeah. Everything else is gravy.
And there's a lot to be said for those things. But it's also the history of the country that we always want more. We want to do more. We want to challenges. We want to.
That's why he's driving 15 hours a day. Yeah. There's why he's here only 4 or 5 years. I don't remember how long he was here. He borrowed a car. He worked his way up, and he was so proud that he now owns this car, and he's able to be his own boss. Forget that, in fact, he's making like $14 an hour. It doesn't matter, because he doesn't see himself doing this for the rest of his life. I own my own business.
He's
aspirational.
He's accumulating capital, and that's going to go into something else, and bim bam, he's going to be the guy being driven around in an Uber by somebody else.
100%. Wilfred Bill McClay, I want to thank you so much. The book is The Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. It's on Amazon for about 20 some more dollars. It's now on Kindle. I see that your publisher's having a sale for $3. What took you, I don't know how long to write. You can't get you can't get a cup of coffee for less than $3 in New York. So I want to tell you, just reading one chapter, someone's just reading one chapter, it's refreshing. it makes you feel good to be an American. So I think you've done an amazing job. And Bill, continued success to you.
Well, the same to you, and it's been a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so
Hope
much.
we can do it again.
Likewise, I definitely. Thanks so much, Bill.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.